Good day, denizens. Welcome back to part 2 of the Mongols. This time we got the Mongols taking over all of China. And when they take over all of China, they'll rename it the Yuan dynasty. And it'll begin under Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan. Looking at this first slide here, you can tell, though, there's going to be something interesting about China during this time. It's going to develop into what we call a syncretic culture. And basically this mixing of different cultures, different ideas, whether it be religion or social ideas, whatever, this mixture of cultures that China takes in under this Yuan dynasty. And you see great evidence here with a stupa, a mosque, and a pagoda all across China in the midst of this Yuan dynasty. So let's get going here. So there he is, Kublai Khan. That's a picture of him shortly after his death, actually. But Kublai Khan comes in, Genghis' grandson, when he takes out the Song Emperor in 1279, and he's going to create a new capital city that he will, of course, call the Khanbalik, which means the city of the Great Khan. But today it is Beijing. And actually the empire that will come in after the Yuan will also move their capital to Beijing. Nonetheless, Kublai Khan, I mean, this dude is going to rule not only China, he's going to take over Korea, he's going to take over Tibet, he's going to take over Vietnam. He actually the Mongols try to take over Japan even, but they try twice and they fail twice, both times because of major storms that brewed up in the Sea of Japan that the Japanese called the kamikaze, or the divine wind, that took out the Mongols twice and kept Japan independent of China. Nonetheless, this Yuan dynasty, this Mongol dynasty, as you can see here, it's not even going to last for 100 years, but it's going to have a huge, huge impact on Chinese history and world history. That's why we talk about it. So the thing about the Mongols, the Yuan dynasty, when it's created, Yuan means like primary, first, kind of like, the new start for China under the Mongols. You can tell from the beginning that the Yuan dynasty is not making very wise decisions. For example, basically they tried to prevent, the Mongols from assimilating into Chinese culture. They wanted to maintain this separate identity for Mongols. So only the Mongols could, lead the military and serve in the military. The big time government jobs were only for Mongols or even non-Chinese. But yet they let the Chinese officials rule like some of the distant provinces. You might remember like the old Fanzhen system, which is not a good idea, as you might imagine. And they adopt this Chinese name. Kublai Khan adopts this Chinese name for his dynasty, the Yuan. But the other thing is that's, maybe a little bit more peculiar is that Kublai Khan is open to all kinds of outside influences. He's got Arab architects coming in to design his palace. He rebuilds, expands the Grand Canal. And a later emperor is going to welcome in Ibn Battuta into the Yuan court. So this Yuan dynasty, the Mongols, they're open to outside influence, just not to Chinese influence, which are the people that they're trying to rule. And you can read here that Kublai Khan had a suggestion box. So do I. So how do we know so much about this empire? A lot of our information actually comes from this guy here, Marco Polo. And Marco Polo, interesting cat. He was probably born in Venice, which was a very prosperous mercantile country by the mid-1300s. But in 1269, Niccolo, Marco's father, and Maffeo, Marco's uncle, they returned to Venice after supposedly traveling through Asia and meeting with Kublai Khan. And having left prior to Marco's birth, when they came back, they met 15-year-old Marco for the first time. And in 1271, Marco now being 17, Marco, his father, and his uncle set off for Asia on a series of adventures that Marco would later document in his book. And they would return to Venice in 1295, that's right, 24 years later, with many riches, a whole lot of treasure, and a whole lot of stories. And supposedly they traveled about 15,000 miles. Unless you're on the metric system, that would be about 24,000 kilometers. Anyway, when he returned, Venice was actually at war with a nearby state called Genoa, both of these places being in Italy. And so what did Marco do? Well, he sided up with Venice. He bought himself a ship, bought himself a trebuchet, and went to fight for Venice. Problem is, he gets captured and thrown in prison by the Genoese. But it's while he's in prison, he dictates his book to one of his cellmates. And of course, the cellmate also added some of his own stories to the book. But nonetheless, with Polo detailing his travels to China. And the book ends up being pretty widely read, called The Travels of Marco Polo, and by many people in Italy and even into other parts of Europe. And the book becomes so popular, it's going to later inspire a guy named Chris Columbus to go on his journeys. But nonetheless, Polo gets out of the slammer in 1299 and actually becomes pretty wealthy. He becomes a wealthy merchant. He ties the knot and has 3 daughters. But to this day, a lot of skeptics question just how far Polo actually traveled, or whether or not his descriptions were obtained from, other people's descriptions, like perhaps even his father and his uncle. And they point out that, he left out names of certain structures, one of those being, well, the Great Wall. Perhaps some skeptics argue that perhaps he only went to Constantinople and just chatted it up with some merchants in the area, and that's where he got all of his stories. But you have other historians and other folk who argue that, in favor of the book's accuracy, saying that, look, Polo's discussion of Christian churches that were built in particular parts of China, you would have had to have been there to have known that. And that he very well, could have just gone past the Great Wall. Maybe he went further to the south where, there was less likelihood of seeing the Great Wall. And other historians point out too that, some of the stuff Ibn Battuta has in his descriptions of China aren't as accurate as some of the stuff Polo has. So we will never know. But regardless, so what Polo does is, he gives us these great descriptions of Kublai Khan's empire. Supposedly, he and his uncle and his pop, they actually stayed in the court of Kublai Khan, and they stayed for so long for a few reasons. They, first of all, were afraid to leave, not knowing how Kublai Khan might react to that. And, they wanted to get some information. Marco Polo in his book goes on and on about how powerful he was and how much power he held and how much sway he held. It's probably some mumbo jumbo there. But nonetheless, we do get some great descriptions. He talks about how the palace walls of the great Khan, were covered in gold with pictures of dragons and birds and horsemen, scenes of battles. But he also points out, that China was pretty well organized, had a great mail system on very swift ponies. They had excellent road system. Hangzhou was 10 to 12 times the size of Venice, which is one of the richest cities in all of Europe. And there you see Marco Polo's lifespan there. And here you see the supposed travels of Marco and his pop and his uncle. There's a map. But back to the Mongols. So the Mongols, they were known for their toleration, ironically enough, and they allowed for a lot of beliefs, as you saw in that first slide with the different religious structures. The Pope sent Christian, priests to Beijing to meet with the Great Khan. Muslims set up communities in China, and China had a great trade and exchange with even Europe. And luckily for the Europeans, from their standpoint, this is how they get things like gunpowder and porcelain, and yes, to pass the time, some playing cards. But the Yuan dynasty is going to run into some issues, and one of those big issues would be the plague. I don't recommend running into the plague, but the Black Death or the plague, the bubonic plague, is just going to decimate the population for 70 years, in 1300. So the Black Death starts well before it starts in Europe. It's going to spread from China over into Europe. But by 1300, you've got severe hunger and scarcity of resources and very weak population. And the other big thing too, and similar thing's going to happen in Europe, is that the Great Khan used the ancient Chinese, I guess, power tradition of the so-called mandate of heaven. But as people were dying from the plague, people began to look around and say, you know what, maybe this dude doesn't have the power of God to rule because he can't seem to protect us from the plague. So really that undercut the power of these Mongol rulers, even the people succeeding, after Kublai Khan. So eventually we get these uprisings, and one of these uprisings is actually led by some Buddhists. It's true. The Red Turbans, called that because they wore red turbans. And eventually they're actually going to drive the Mongols out of China. And they will actually start an entirely new empire that they will call the Ming Empire. Ming meaning brilliant or bright. And the first ruler will be the Hongwu, or the marshal, the commander in charge. There he is. So the Yuan dynasty, even after Kublai Khan, its first ruler, it almost immediately goes into decline, and we saw those reasons a few slides back. But obviously most Chinese despised the fact that they were being ruled by Mongols, and then on top of that, not being government jobs or being allowed to play in any of the reindeer games. And obviously, just like we saw with Tang and with the Song, you get heavy taxes, you get corruption. Add that to some natural disasters like the plague, that's going to give you some uprisings, and that's going to give you not so much stability. And the Great Red Turban Rebellion is going to basically overthrow this Yuan, this Mongol dynasty. And you can see that the Ming, they are Chinese, and they will restore Chinese rule. And as you can see down there, they're going to be around for a while. And here's a description that gives you an idea of just how much love the Red Turbans had for the Mongols. Just kidding. They despised them. If you're willing to read that there, you will see some rather troubling things in terms of how the Red Turbans took down the Mongols. But one of the big things they used, of course, was a relatively new invention, the gun. And we'll check that out in some video clippage. So anyway, the Hongwu, with this Ming dynasty now running the show in China, they basically, they try to bring back China and Chinese culture and Chinese civilization, reform the economy. And the Ming rulers, they saw themselves as these kind of moral and spiritual leaders of their subjects, right? They kind of viewed themselves as patriarchs or parents, father figures, and guardians of the Chinese. And the Ming emperors are guarded by an army of eunuchs because, the emperor didn't necessarily trust all those guys around him running, helping him run the show. And these eunuchs are just fanatically loyal. They do, and carry out orders, whatever the Ming emperor wants. And of course, one of the big things that comes out of this Ming Empire is they build themselves a big old capital and some pretty buildings that come to be called the Forbidden City. That is going to be this huge governing complex. We'll look at that here in a second. But other things they do, they add to the Great Wall. The way you see the Great Wall now is pretty much what the Ming had constructed, with elaborate, guard towers and reinforcements, bricks, and widening the thing and all that jazz. Because, they're always worried about the return of the Mongols. They develop a bureaucracy, again, very well trained. They bring back the civil service exam. They improve the Grand Canal and build other canals. They're getting it done. Here you see parts of the Forbidden City. It's very pretty, so too bad it was forbidden because, you like to see all this. And this is the Ming capital that they actually moved to, Beijing, which was 500 miles away from the original Ming capital, but nonetheless was surrounded, this forbidden city, by a wall 15 miles long and 40 feet high. So think about that. Think about a town near you now that is 15 miles away, and that's how long that wall was. It became the administrative hub, in other words, the main point of administration, where the government officials lived and ran the entirety of the country of China under this Ming dynasty. It had the imperial palace in there. It had 10,000 rooms, count them, 10,000 rooms. Every single room, in order to enter it, you had to get the emperor's permission. Can you imagine all the permission requests? What if you had to go to the bathroom? So yeah, what the Ming do, they bring China back, right? Rebirth of Chinese culture and traditions. They bring back the civil service exam, woohoo! Some Confucian learning. But now the exams are the most rigorous ever, as if they weren't before. This is where, as we talked about a few weeks back, where they officially have, out in the fields, not like the Who song, that's out there in the fields, where you fight for your meals. But here they would create these fields surrounded by a wall, and you would have this, kind of brick cubicle out in the middle of nowhere, where for, 48, 72 straight hours, you did nothing but write and write and write and write. And then when you got done, you did some more writing, unless you died. If you died during the exam, the people who were monitoring the exam would come around, grab your body, and throw it out over the wall. But nonetheless, yeah, you have a board of censors, as they call them, monitoring the bureaucracy, trying to root out corruption. Problem is, of course, they become corrupt. It's always the key question. You have the servants, but who shall serve the servants? The population is going to grow to 100 million people. That's pretty serious, even today, let alone back in, 1500s. And, a lot of this is because of, once again, new farming techniques. They start using this stuff called fertilizer. And even by the 1500s, by then we, of course, have the discovery of the New World. So we start seeing new foods come into Eurasia and China specifically that they had never seen before. Things like corn, things like sweet potatoes. I mean, what would we do without sweet potato fries? It's a really good alternative. And the Ming are also famous for their coins. Remember, China had been, under the Song, using this paper currency, but this was defied by the Ming, and they went back to some coinage. And these coins, usually the monetary economies using money, start out with coins, made from some kind of precious metal, and eventually, graduate or evolve into paper money because it's lighter, it's easier. But people don't trust paper, never have. In China, paper money was, introduced back during, the Tang Song dynasties. But by the middle of this Ming era, instability of paper currency led it to be replaced by coins. And they were minted from silver and actually imported from the Spanish Empire and Japan. And they're getting this stuff because of the discovery of the New World. And we'll talk about this obviously once we get to the discovery of the New World, but nonetheless, you have all kinds of silver pouring in from South American mines coming into China. In 1639, there's a trade dispute in Hiroshima and a diplomatic conflict with Spain, Japan, and a diplomatic conflict with Spain over the treatment of Chinese merchants in the Philippines actually cut off China's silver supplies, and a drop in imports spurred hoarding. In other words, people not really spending money, hoarding it, holding on to it, including those McDonald's styrofoam cups. And, this just made the crisis even worse and really hurt the dynasty. But you might notice that you have a square hole in those there coins. So ancient Chinese coins were cast or poured into molds, not stamped or milled or anything like that. When molding these coins, something called flash is a material that overflows through the casting molds joining spaces. So in order to make a uniform coin, after the casting, the coins were put on a dowel or a rod, so that many of them could be filed down at one time. And obviously this rod would need to be square so that the coin doesn't spin around while you're filing it down. Now, older round Chinese coins did have round holes in them, but one effect of this was that the money could be stored on strings. There are a variety of philosophical meanings assigned to the square hole round coin phenomena, but these are likely an after effect from the practical filing needs. Nonetheless, one theory on Chinese coins is that the hole represents the square Earth, while the round coin is the universe, or that the square hole is China at the center of the universe. Where else would it be? There you see the Great Wall. It takes on its look thanks to the Ming. That's pricey. And the Ming vase, as you see here, you've probably heard of that very famous term, the Ming vase. Well, it's because of the Ming Dynasty. And I have to say, it is pretty. You look those things up on eBay, they ain't cheap, and rightfully so. Obviously, arts and literature are revived in China. It's the same old story. Another golden age, same thing that we saw with the Tang and the Song, and well before them, the Han. You get an original Ming vase today, that thing's going to go for millions of dollars. We actually, during this time, start to see novels and detective stories, and even, like opera with dance and music and drama. But another huge thing that the Ming do is this oceanic travel. And the great admiral, Zhonghe, the eunuch admiral, has one of the largest fleets on the planet at this time. Probably, actually, sorry, not one of, the largest fleet on the planet at this time. And you can see here in a museum, that ship there depicted, that would be his flagship, Zhonghe's flagship. And the ship that they're comparing it to would be, yes, Christopher Columbus's flagship of his 3 ships. All 3 of Columbus's ships would have fit inside of the Chinese admiral's main ship. Yeah, these are pretty serious ships. And as you can see here, Zhonghe and his massive fleet, they traverse the entirety of the Indian Ocean. They go into the Red Sea. They go over to the eastern coast of Africa. They go up into the Persian Gulf. They're all the way down in Indonesia, near Java, and all the way up on the eastern coast of China. I mean, this is a serious armada doing some serious travel. India, Southeast Asia, East Africa. And they expand the tributary relations of the Ming Dynasty. Tributary, in other words, tribute states. They get more states to give them money. You see these big ships cruising in, and you say, you know what? We prefer for you guys not to come back, so we'll pay you to leave us alone annually. The problem is that when the admiral dies, the Mings and the Ming emperor at the time is rather paranoid. So he proceeds to actually destroy all the ships. And the entire flotilla is destroyed. And a reason is because the Chinese viewed overseas trade as a source of instability, right? Outsiders coming in. And you can understand where that would come from. I mean, they were just controlled by the Mongols for almost 100 years, right? So they have this kind of fear of outsiders, but then again, they always have. Great Wall. So basically, this Chinese naval power declines and opens the door for the Europeans to, by the 14 and 1500s, become the great seafarers and discoverers of the New World. And consider this. What if Zhonghe and his fleet, what if they had gone to the east across the Pacific instead of going to the west across the Indian Ocean? Could they have eventually run into the western coast of what is today the United States or Canada? Or Central America or South America. Who knows? Here is a very controversial map. This supposedly is Zhonghe's 1418 map of the world. Yes, 1418. If you look there on the right, well, that looks a heck of a lot like North and South America. Nope. Read below. So For the Ming, obviously they're going to fall as well, but 300 years. But they're going to fall actually to a group from the north, the Manchus. So outsiders end up getting them after all. This group of Manchus from a place called, you guessed it, Manchuria, are going to invade and actually take over the Ming Empire. But obviously, what brings down the Ming? Many of the same things, right? A lot of military spending, which means you have to have a lot of money, which means you have to have higher taxes. Some of the more distant regions are neglected. We've heard this story before. You have a lot of disgruntled workers who, when the economy was down, they would lose their job, including one postal messenger. That's right, a mailman who helps to lead a rebellion and overthrow the Ming. And these Manchus are going to come in after. The mailman actually takes over for a little while, but then the Manchus come in and take him out. And the last Ming emperor actually, hangs himself from a tree in the imperial garden in the Forbidden Palace. The Manchus come in. They're going to create the Qing dynasty, and this will be the last Chinese dynasty that will last all the way until the 20th century. They'll rule for yet another 300 years, this Qing dynasty. But remember, they are outsiders. They are not Chinese. They are Manchu. So you can already imagine the issues that are going to come with that.